Okay, let's go ahead and kick things off. Some people are still rolling in. Um, just in terms of timing, right? So with us today we have Nick Hayes, Senior Analyst at Forrester, and then Phil Marshall from Security Scorecard. Nick's going to talk about security ratings for about 30 or so minutes, and then turn it over to Phil. Phil will talk for 10 minutes or so, and that'll leave us time for questions. So please keep that in mind. If you have any questions kind of while the webinar is in session, just put them over into the chat box. And then when we finish up here, we'll go ahead and take a look at all those, and we can ask either Phil or Nick or turn it over to both of them. So without further ado, thank you everybody for attending. And just a reminder too, this is recorded. We'll be sharing it with everybody afterwards. But yeah, go ahead, Nick, take us away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today to talk to you about security risk ratings and why they're becoming a really critical tool for actually managing vendor risk in today's environment. So there's a lot to talk about here. I think we can point to a number of events that are taking place when we start to think about vendor risk, when we start to think about how cybersecurity is impacting organizations worldwide. You know, when we start thinking about the different types of issues that can come up, the first that comes to mind for me is actually one that we've seen come up a number of times in the form of ransomware, where actually it's not necessarily your organization that's getting hit by a particular attack, but the other strategic partners and organizations that you rely on that then go down. And so we've seen this happen at a massive scale with WannaCry and Petya and not Petya and others. 2017 was certainly you know, part of it was at least the rise of global ransomware. And then, you know, it also affects your business partners are also putting your own data at risk. You know, so HBO is a good example of this when some of their content was actually stolen by, through one of their final publishers or producers of the final content, not an HBO entity, but an entity that they work closely with, and that was where the content got stolen. So that's why their Game of Thrones series ultimately got linked and was actually posted live in a couple of different cases before it was actually set to go live. And then lastly, probably not lastly, I should just say these are three big examples of some of the issues that are taking place. But there's also externally sourced applications that have their own vulnerabilities in it. And a lot of times in those cases, the applications that you're sourcing, that you have at your organization, even though they can be trusted applications, in some cases they have vulnerabilities, and thinking about how you actually protect your organization in terms of what software products you use is another thing that we also have to look at. So this is a little bit of where I see risk managers today. This is from Spaceballs, still an all-time classic, and I guess somewhat relevant again now that with the new Star Wars set to release. But this is them combing the sand, trying to find the people that they're looking for, and of course, are combing the desert. And so in some cases, this is the way that I think we all are struggling to manage risk, to manage vendor risk, more importantly, in today's environment. There's so much information, and there's a number of issues that come up for us. So when I see the third-party risk challenges for organizations, they're just more third parties that are proliferating. They're more critical to the business. And this is more difficult to deal with just because of all the information both the information that they have, as well as you just relying on them to ensure that your business performs at the expected rate. And risk events are worsening. The impact is growing more severe. When there's one event, the actual damage that it's costing the organization hurts the organization even more. There's long and resource-intense assessment processes. So today, in a lot of cases, what what's taking, well, what your third parties are also struggling with just as much as you are in terms of filling out RFPs, filling out and responding to different types of entities that you're working with. They're also struggling with completing all the different third-party risk assessments that they have to fill out and get back to you. And so it's taking them longer. And in some cases, it's resulting in gaps in information, gaps of actual consistency of getting the information when you need it. And so you have this area where there's actually a lot of times where you have inconsistent data because you can't get the responses back in time, or they're incomplete responses with some information missing that you really need to see to ensure that you're properly understanding and assessing the risks associated with them. And then lastly, there's just external factors that are starting to influence risk posture. There's geopolitical issues, there's severe weather even for some of the third-party events. All of these are taking place and making it even more difficult to manage risk for your organization today. And so how do we solve it? And I put this up here because I know it's lunchtime for many, depending on where you're calling in from. But more importantly, this is actually an interesting case where Facebook, the University of Oxford did a study about people and looking at connections of people on Facebook who were more intelligent based on certain types of likes that they issued. And they found that people were more likely to have a high IQ if they liked curly fries. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that they're actually going to go out and that if I go out today and I like curly fries, it doesn't boost my intelligence. But we start to think about all the different pieces of metadata, right? So just liking French fries along with many of the others, we start to build up more context. We start to build up a better view of who the individuals are and how we can start to understand them and what decisions we can make based on that. So I'm using this as a way to start how we can talk about and think about third parties and think about the different types of risk data that we need to build that context. So we can't develop the insight directly in these cases. We need to find other ways that you can help do that. So this is an image from one of my reports where I'm showing how you can apply data clustering and how you can do different types of social link analysis and entity attribution to really start to parse out some of the unknown connections, some of the unknown ways in which your organization is working with others. And then through this information and through this type of advanced analytics, you'll start to be able to identify those that are risky that you might not have noticed before. And I think that's really the core piece here, is that we're missing a huge part, and it's so time consuming to actually think about all the different areas that we have to manage for our, as part of vendor risk. And so what we're doing here is really thinking about how we build that context in new ways. And it's not to say that in every case that if we start talking about security ratings, we start talking about the scores, it's not going to say that every single vendor that has a lower score is definitely going to be going to have a data breach or expose you to different types of data loss or security risks. It's saying that it is a higher risk. It's a higher area that you have to start looking into. And there's a number of different ways that we're going to get into in terms of how you can actually leverage that information. So why vendor risk monitoring and scoring is important. So when we start to think about how we build that context and how vendor risk monitoring and scoring can actually help with that, there's a number of kind of core fundamental ways that I see that it can really help organizations, and a lot of them are already starting to see some of the benefits of this. The first is that they provide a quick view into their third-party cyber risk exposure without the need for vendor interaction up front. So that what we're looking at and actually showing here is that you're able to get a glance and be able to see what you want to about your vendors right away, rather than needing to build all and ask all these different questions. You'd have more real-time context right up front. Secondly, it helps you identify risky vendor relationships for you to prioritize reviews and offer suggested mitigation tactics. So with this area, you're really able to start thinking about what are the areas of risk for your organization related to your vendor relationships, and then you can start to prioritize which vendors, which tier 1 vendors you really need to spend more time with, what questions you need to ask them during your additional questionnaires or during your remediation process with them. And you can start to also take that information and use it in other ways in terms of looking at how you can actually assess it for on-site reviews, asking specific questions that help pull out and get you the information that you need to feel comfortable in terms of working with them. Thirdly, it validates vendor-provided information and questionnaire gaps where you may have them. So there may be inconsistencies with the actual questionnaires and the information that you get back. And this can help either identify areas where there is an inconsistency so that you can follow up and make sure that and understand where the mistake was. And then fill out other information where you may be missing it. And another way in which it helps is it can help benchmark your vendor risk posture right now versus your competitors or versus industry norms. So helping to give you a better picture of where you may be in terms of a maturity for your industry when you start thinking about your own risk exposure. So behind the scores, how they work, and we're definitely going to go, excuse me, we're definitely going to go into more detail about this, but what I really want to focus on is some of the core underlying ways in which security ratings scoring takes place. And so there's, in my view, there's ultimately 4 steps in this process. So if we start at thinking about how a solution will start to help you assess and help score vendors, they're first going to start looking at how they collect data. They're going to pull data from all sorts of sources using their own open source intelligence, data feeds, threat security feeds, honeypots, all these different ways to collect information, which can be as broad as everything from social media chatter to dark web chatter, and using that all and helping to normalize it. And that's really the next step. So after they collect all the data, we have to get to a point where you don't get inundated with a lot of duplicate answers, a lot of duplicate information that creates a lot of noise and reduces the relevance of the events. And if you don't have that type of normalization, it doesn't end up being helpful information for you. So the second part is really a critical piece and something that you should try to look at and really analyze how they're going to go about that, because just as important of actually collecting and finding unique data, it's making sure that the data that you have is as relevant and focused as you can make it. And then thirdly, it's looking at individual risk factor scores for each vendor. So the final area is the ultimate vendor rating. And we start to think about that in terms of looking at how organizations are doing. But really, when we start parsing back, whether that's a number or A through F score, we start to be able to pull out and look at the individual factors that actually start making that up. And that's really important in terms of looking at how you identify what questions or what areas you may be at risk with your with your vendors, excuse me. And so you're going to be able to start parsing out individual areas that you need to really ensure that you have the right mitigation strategy for. So DNS health, CVEs, patching cadence, dark web chatter, how much are you willing to balance in terms of what you're willing to accept as a risk as you work with a vendor, and how much is too much of a threat for where you actually have to start thinking about how you work with that vendor and how you make sure that they have better processes in place. So, so the differentiating features and functionality that I see of vendors, I apologize for this build out here. So I'll start over on the right. And on the right, I think one of the areas that's really important is the risk analytics piece. So how advanced is the data processing techniques that ensure risk relevance and in-depth reviews by risk managers? So really taking a look at the process that we just looked at before and helping parse out all the different ways in terms of how you're going to be using that data. And secondly, a proven score breach correlation. This is definitely an area that I think you should be paying attention to. Is how is the solutions provider for your security ratings solution? How are they going to actually be building out and showing that the ratings that they come up with overall are actually correlated and related to historic data loss? And so be looking at how they're doing that and in what cases they're able to show that it continues to that you continue to kind of look at and improve that correlation. And thirdly, vendor review and collaboration. So thinking about once you have those high-risk vendors that you need to start working with to remediate unacceptably high risks. Once you know that there's a real need to actually have features and functionality built into the system to help you go through that remediation process. And this can be in the form of sending out detailed reports at no additional costs. It can be looking at purpose-built workflows and integrated collaboration portals where you're actually able to go through and through the system actually show where there can be issues and help your third party actually take that information and update it and update their progress to help ensure that they meet the deadlines that you've set in terms of meeting areas where they're too high of a risk. And more about the data, it's also about data collection. And we talked about it on the last slide, but really importantly, when you're looking at the data collection processes, where are they getting data from? How are the analysts and the other, the other ways of data collection techniques that they have, are they providing you differentiated data and helping you really make sure that you have all the information that you can about your third parties? And secondly and then next is also looking at that dark web and threat intel. So their ability to actually infiltrate dark web channels and aggregate specific security and threat intelligence and anonymous or otherwise difficult to access channels on Tor or others. And then the risk analysis and visualization. So this is different from risk analytics in the sense that we're really talking about, in this case, how are they actually creating the calculations and going beyond volume or sentiment to actually create ways of looking at and assessing risk in ways that actually help you make the right decisions about how to assess third-party risk and the risks related to one vendor in particular. And lastly, look to see how you can actually build integration into GRC platforms, whether it's Archer or others that you're using for that type of process. You're going to need, it's a security ratings solution isn't necessarily going to replace a GRC or tool or however you're conducting the risk assessments currently, but it should be complementing and supplementing your other data and the way that you've interacted with vendors in the past. So you have the scores, you have all the information. What do you do next? I wanted to bring you through this process too, because this is one of the areas when I talk to clients that they have even more difficulty, not just in terms of getting the right information, but how do you actually work with your vendors to make sure that you've set remediation plans, make sure that you actually reduce the risk that you have with the organization. So if we think that the first step is, okay, you've gone through and used security ratings accurately and well to the point that you've identified risky vendors. Once you do that, once you know who they are and which ones you need to work with first, then you need to take that information and reconcile it with your own internal data. So looking for areas where is this overall, a similar approach with your and similar view with your own internal information and the questionnaires that you do have, or is there major gaps in that, and what are those gaps and areas that could be, off? Then once you have a good picture, both in terms of the security ratings data, the vendors that you know are risky, and the ones that you need to look at and have gone through and really have a good picture of that vendor, then the next step is to review what your mitigation options are. In this case, there could be some vendors where you decide that they're so risky that even if you work with them, that it's not going to be enough, and so that you have to actually stop relations with them. I think that's an extreme example, but it does happen in some cases. But the other mitigation options can be, reaching out, working with the vendors, setting, requirements that the vendors have to meet over the next year, 2 years, in order to actually continue to work with you, and regular check-ins, regular updates based on their progress towards meeting those goals. And the other is internal actions that you can take on your end to reduce your exposure, reducing the information that you send to vendors, or the information that they have. So once you've chosen and determined your mitigation path, the next step, if you choose to actually interact and continue working on, which I think will be the case for most of the vendors, is inviting them to view your scores, inviting them to actually understand how you're looking at them. And again, I actually see customers taking two types of approaches here, and I mean for sure customers. They really take two different approaches. So one approach is to invite and have the vendors, your vendors, actually review the scores and show them, and I think that is the best practice. But another way that you can also choose to use the information is to use it to help supplement your on-site reviews with them, to make sure that you're asking detailed questions about particular areas. That can also be one way in which you can get more information or ask targeted questions and really parse through the areas and get more specific information while you're on site or while you're conducting that in-depth investigation. And then, assuming that you go with the former, though, and assuming that you actually want to work with the vendor in a collaborative way, once you've invited them, given them an opportunity to review their scores, then it's time to actually set what you want them to do and what they're willing to do. And so that's where you're going to set the remediation plans and really make sure that you've actually built the right plans in place and see them through. And then as you go through that process, you get back to the beginning, where if the remediation plans, after you've gone through them for 6 months or a year or more, then you're going to need to start identifying them as a risky vendor again and go through the same process. But beyond what I've already mentioned, there's actually a number of other ways that we can leverage this type of vendor risk intelligence. We can onboard new vendors faster and discover hidden third parties that you may not have known your organization is actually working with. And this can be from a software solutions perspective, thinking about shadow IT in many cases, or other organizations that your other business functions didn't necessarily tell you that they were using or working with. So all that can be done through looking at and identifying the scores and associating, again, through that kind of bigger context of understanding which business entities are working with your organization. Secondly, you can verify with GRC data and investigate those major gaps. Thirdly, you can review your own scores to benchmark and inform strategy. So thinking about how you can actually use that information that you have to understand what you need to do for your own organization, use them to benchmark where your security maturity is today and where you want to take it in the future. The next is that you can actually add your score as a metric for executive and board reporting. A lot of clients are actually, Forrester clients are actually using some of the information from their security ratings to actually go in and make sure that they're looking at you're providing executives with information and using the ratings to actually build out their security dashboards and reports that they give to executives. And this is a good way to help starting to have that risk conversation with them. Still, there's a lot of security metrics that you can use, but in many cases it's overkill or too much information that the board doesn't necessarily understand. So by building out and showing what your actual risk exposure is in an easily digestible way, gives them more information, helps them understand from a business perspective what they should and shouldn't be doing. So in addition to you making the most out of it for your security strategy, they can start to get at least a view into what and how your organization is doing. And then I think this is a really interesting use case where you can actually use it during cyber insurance negotiations. So many cyber insurers are using security ratings and risk analytics to assess what your risk exposure is and determine what policy they're willing to offer you at what rate, as well as the premiums in that too. And so if you have a better understanding of where you are, you can more accurately determine if you should be getting maybe a better rate or making sure that costs don't rise too much because, or at all, because your risk exposure has remained or gone down. So you can actually use that information, again, I guess against them. But also in the reverse, if you're an insurer, it's also very helpful information that can help you, again, kind of think about and build better context for what those policies and make more informed offers for your clients. And lastly, an interesting way is using it during your mergers and acquisition reviews. Still, a lot of times organizations don't necessarily include security or IT in the conversation of some of their strategic acquisition targets or plans. I think that is changing for the better, but I've definitely seen a number of organizations have misfires because of the amount of additional effort and the amount of time it actually takes to bring on a new entity that they didn't realize actually all of the security and data security, data privacy, and other kind of tools and processes that they would then have to update that organization because it was actually very immature from that security standpoint. So the more that you're able to use that information use security rating scores and information for your specific M&A targets, I think there's going to be some interesting correlation too, as well as if there are certain poor security ratings, it can also be an indicator of potentially, the business overall not doing as well. I don't know if we exactly have that data except for anecdotal evidence at this point, but there's obviously a number of ways that it can be valuable regardless. So 3 questions to ask, I think, really to help you start to make use of this data right now and determine what you need to do with it. The first is, what risk data do you need? What are you struggling with in terms of, is it the frequency that you have or getting your information from vendors? Is it that the vendors aren't actually responding or answering certain parts of your questionnaire? So thinking about those in particular areas where you may not have coverage at the moment, thinking maybe you don't have ways to actually look at dark nets and chatter that could be relevant to data loss, to different types of events that, again, about your third parties that actually could be relevant to determining what their risk is. So think about what types of data, what sources you need, and how you need it to be collected. And then secondly, how will it inform your decisions? What will you use that information for? This is a really important question to ask yourself and to ask your team, because you're going to want to make use of this information as quickly as possible, and you'll want to know what you're actually going to do. So when you actually know and ask this question about how it will help kind of inform your current and existing process and how it will help you determine what your remediation steps and what your mitigation kind of thresholds are, think about those as you're first approaching and thinking about a solution. And then thirdly, do you know what's really at stake? So in many cases for the organization or for you, there can be other ways in which the organization, as the vendor, is exposing your data, exposing you to unacceptable risks that you really need to be aware of, but might not right now. So again, just kind of another last question. Do you know how they're actually impacting, or what the impact would be if certain data or if certain information that you're already providing them or they're given access to, it's going to potentially or could potentially hurt your organization? So really, when you actually look at what you need to look at for a solution, we've talked a lot about the best practices. We talked about a number of different areas that are the differentiating features. I think that, for the most part, all of it comes back to the data. You have to have the right risk data. And in order to make sure that you have the right risk data, these are the 7 areas that I think you really want to focus on. The first is the access. So APIs pay for access data. We talked about security intelligence fees as well. And what you also want to consider is the data gathering techniques. Thinking about how data crawlers, bots, sensors, honeypots, how they can actually hurt your organization and be used to help you build better techniques. Thirdly, penetration. How in-depth is the information that you're going? How holistic is their coverage? Fourthly, the frequency, scanning rates. How frequently are you going to want the data, and how frequently do you want it for specific channels? Some of it may be delivered quarterly, monthly, but more frequently, I think is more of the norm. So seeing it as weekly or daily, or even more frequently than daily, I think is the common scanning rate for many of the different data types. But making sure that for those areas that you really want access to and really want more information about, make sure that they're meeting those requirements. And then the transparency. This is a key area, making sure that the data granularity, the way in which you can actually dive in and understand what your vendor is exposed to from a risk perspective, being able to actually go through and parse out, if you have that A through F score, if you have a vendor with a B- rating, for example, or a B score, what are the elements that actually are comprising of that? And what are the areas within that B that are limiting the vendor from achieving an A? And then within that, can you start to understand how that number was comprised, how they actually came up with the number, and what you can do to actually understand more fully basically how to use that information based on how detailed it is. And then configurability. So can you adjust the weightings for your own organization? Can you set different risk tolerance or thresholds that you want to take based on your own organizations, or maybe even different types of alerts? If dark web chatter chatter, for example, gets too high? Can you start to get alerted to different issues like that? And then actionable output. The rating relevance, helpful recommendations, actionable recommendations as well. So based on the overall scores and the overall underlying attributes of that score, are there ways that you can start to parse out and determine what the right questions are to ask? And can that solution help you come up with those actionable next steps?
Hey Nick,
So
it's really great. You want we're coming up on time a little bit. You want to give one final thought, and then we'll send it over to Phil.
Yeah. So this is a slide here from Sony, and I think this is a really good quote here, because the head of Sony security, before their first data breach was announced, he was on record with a report saying, "I will not spend $10 million to fix a $1 million problem." And while that's a great approach, and of course I don't think he was really saying that in terms of actual dollar numbers, more as a theoretical scenario, that's certainly the right approach to take a risk-based decision. But overall, he didn't have the right information at that time to make that decision. So it wasn't a $1 million problem. He was really facing $100 million or more of a problem than that. So getting to a point where you actually know what that information is really going to be important. So you want to take that same approach. Make sure that you're making the right risk-based decisions and having the context and the ability to know what those are. And I think that's a great stopping point and me moving on.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to toss it over to Phil. Again, a bunch of questions coming through, so thank you, everybody. We'll get to them as soon as we're wrapping up here. I can answer one. I did remember to hit the record button, so this will be available afterwards. So Phil, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
So can you see the Security Scorecard overview slide?
Sure can. Good to go.
All right, great. Thank you. So thanks, Nick. I really appreciate it. I think you've given our attendees some really compelling reasons to look at the security ratings tools, or what we like to call the ecosystem risk management solutions. And what I'd like to do is just provide some details around what Security Scorecard provides. So first, it's really relevant that we talk about why we're here. So our two founders, Alex and Sam, they saw the need for Security Scorecard while they were both at Gilt Group. They were asked a fundamental, but at the time, really difficult question to answer, and their CEO wanted to know just how secure they were. And so after staying up for several nights exchanging ideas around just how they might determine the answer to that question, they really had framed the essence of what Security Scorecard has become. So organizations can now trust a platform that provides them with an accurate rating of their ecosystem's security profile. So, you know, pushing out a thanks to Sam and Alex. So who do we work with? At present, we're working with hundreds of industry leaders, both here and in Europe, including these brands, but also in addition to these organizations, we're working with BNY Mellon, Charter, Home Depot, Goldman Sachs, Hilton very recently. So it's these solutions are, as Nick said, becoming much more widespread, and we're certainly seeing that amongst our customer group. Well, you know, why is this category picking up speed? What's interesting is that it's a sport that we're not getting any better at, unfortunately. So the 2017 data breach report from Verizon indicates that 75% of breaches are really the result of poor third-party security. That's up from 70% with a 2015 report and up from previous reports as well. So now, you know, what are hackers doing? What part of the attack surface are they focused on? Well, multiple studies have now shown that over the last several years, the majority of data breaches are attributed in some way to poor third-party security. And this really shouldn't be surprising. why not come into your organization through an acquired username and password combination from one of your vendors who has broad access to your network? You know, hackers aren't going to work any harder than they have to. So this is a list on this slide of just some of the largest institutions that have been breached by one of their third parties in the past few years. Each of these breaches resulted in millions of dollars of lost business and associated costs. In fact, according to Cybersecurity Ventures, the estimated cost of cybercrime damage will be over $6 trillion annually by 2021. A little scary. So one of my favorite slides is questionnaires, hours, security scorecard, seconds. One of the reasons for this category to, again, take off is just around timing. Let's assume that you're continuing to use vendor questionnaires. It is a time-consuming process, and while they do provide important information, their limitation is that they're simply point-in-time view into the potential risk that a vendor represents. They can also, as Nick indicated, be biased and subjective. With Security Scorecard, consequently, you can instantly identify high-risk vendors that you may not have the resources to audit annually, and we provide collaborative features that help those vendors remediate vulnerabilities. You can upload all your vendors, prioritize by tier, sort by riskiest score, and work with those risky vendors to remediate. And most important as a differentiator is that Security Scorecard continues to monitor these vendors and alert you when scores degenerate or degrade. So let's drill into the limits of paper-based solutions. While hackers are finding new ways of breaching third parties, usually with a secondary target in mind, most methods of third-party risk management are really stuck in the past. Paper-based methods, well, they're inefficient, don't have true risk in mind, assess third parties at a single point in time, as I mentioned, and really can't be applied to increasing the number of third parties that you have. And think about it, over 800 new CVEs are announced almost every month. Under traditional methods, it would really require an army of people, and that would really provide limited ROI on your security investment. So I'm just going to build this out. This is a really pretty but simplified representation of a typical vendor ecosystem. You know, it shows third parties, fourth parties, and lots of different vendors supplying many different services. Paper-based tools can only scale to assess maybe, I don't know, 15 to 20% from many conversations with customers of third-party ecosystems, and usually just provide you with the highest risk vendors. This leaves large areas of unmanaged security risk, oftentimes resulting in no visibility at all into the security programs at 80 to 90% of your vendor ecosystem. And also no continuous monitoring, proactive collaboration with the vendors. So what happens if security goes sideways in one of your high-risk vendors between annual assessments and you don't even know about it? And finally, there's compliance risk. Regulators are shining a very bright light these days on third-party programs. How do you prove you're doing enough? So what's the Security Scorecard process? Well, to keep it relatively simple today, we gather as much threat intelligence data as possible using non-intrusive, like we like to call outside-in methods, and then we normalize and score the data using patented machine learning algorithms, and then, based on the threat, businesses are graded and benchmarked against each other. So here's essentially our stack, and this will very much mirror what Nick was describing. So we're going to dive a layer deeper, and let me walk you through this stack. So we've invested about 4 years and millions of dollars into developing our own data collection and processing platform. Frankly, a huge differentiator for us in the space. We hold several US patents on this technology, and there are several more that we've filed. So starting at the lower end of the slide with data collection, with that layer, We have built a proprietary collection of sensors and software, honeypots and sinkholes, which continuously observe millions of security signals every day across the entire IPv4 space, i.e. the entire internet. Our R&D team then continuously innovates on the techniques, and this allows us to collect the deepest and broadest set of interesting security signals in the marketplace. The next step is we then process and curate this data in an internal big data platform that we call Threat Market. We normalize the data, we then remove noise from signals and organize it into relevant security silos. This system also does global IP attribution, incredibly important, which allows the platform to calculate which internet-facing IP addresses belong to which companies. Next is our risk factor grades and overall grade. Our data platform now has a huge library of continuously updated threat signals, organized into 10 factors and attributed to thousands of different companies. We then apply a scoring algorithm to each company, which gives an overall A to F letter grade, and individual factor grades, which is a benchmark score comparing the relative security risk of a given company to its peer group of similarly sized companies in the same industry, essentially making it very actionable. So our SaaS platform displays all of the company scorecards and organizes the data for effective monitoring, ongoing reporting, and management of third-party security. So now you're empowered to take prompt action. What does that mean at a high level? Well, now you can show due diligence with regulators by keeping your audit log up to date with evidentiary records. You can also reduce third-party breach risk, keeping your company out of the news. And for instance, Nick touched on this, and we know from our data that we keep historically, is that companies with a D or F score are 5.4 more times likely to cause a breach for their organizations than those with an A or B score. So this type of analytic is truly predictive. It also scales your third-party security program without adding resources. So for existing vendors, ratings are largely used to visualize and quantify where your risk is across a large number of vendors. It can also help you prioritize vendors for remediation workflows to close open security issues and reduce their risk. It also provides, another point is it provides C-level and board reporting on progress to reduce third-party risk. And for new vendors, it's really important to do security assessments in the RFP stage without the full questionnaire process, enabling a much faster contracting and onboarding process and far less effort on your team's part. For instance, medium and low risk vendors, you might fast track them through the contractual process. So quite useful depending on which stage of the process you're within. So what does it look like? Here's a redacted screenshot of the first page of our portfolio. It shows the overall rating of several vendors and alerts you to which ones you might want to take a harder look at. For instance, if you look at the third vendor down, you might want to take a closer look at them. Their rating has dropped 29% and is now in the D range. So your organization might want to step deeper into the platform to this level, and then look at what we call the scorecard breakdown, which gives you a view that provides a snapshot of all discovered vendor vulnerabilities by security factor, including high, medium, and low severity. So not for today, but let's say you want to dig into what the TLS weak cipher issues are, which is under medium severity here in this slide, the first issue, and there's out of the 36 findings, 19 of them are under TLS protocol using a weak cipher. So the platform will show the CVE. If you click on that, the platform will show the CVE, its definition, associated IP address, and also provide recommended remediation, really enabling organizations and their vendors to improve profiles. So that's a quick look. More than happy to provide demos and go even deeper into the platform to show you how just granular it can become. So what are customers saying? This is a quote from Al Berg at LiquidNet. And certainly, from a time perspective, I'm just going to run through a couple of these case studies. To summarize, with Children's Hospital of Minnesota, they were able to identify risks that they were unaware of prior to using Security Scorecard, and then drill down to show which machine was causing a lower patching score. So that's fairly granular for sure. Farm Credit, their use case was to move really from paper to online assessments, enabling their security team to really focus on vendor remediation. And lastly, HealthWise has been able to help their vendors become aware of and then remediate their security profiles when their scores have degraded over time. Simply not possible with paper-based systems. So I guess that gives you a very quick but hopefully concise walkthrough of Security Scorecard. So I want to thank everybody, but also understand that we're excited about giving you as much detail as you'd like on at future points. So at this point, Nick and I would love to answer any questions that you may have. So Jonathan, have you got some questions that have come in?
Yeah, we actually had a bunch roll in, so we'll get to a few, and then we'll follow up after the webinar until, for the ones that we're unfortunately unable to get to, just a quick reminder to everyone too, if anyone's curious about their own score, we do have a free score functionality on our website if you go and hit free score. Or if you want to learn more or do a deeper demo, go to the website and request a demo or respond to one of the reminder emails from Jonathan. That's me, and I'll get you scheduled. But yeah, so first one coming in. So let's say we're trying to add a company to our portfolio that you haven't rated yet, and this is for you, Phil. How long does it take you to score that particular company?
That's a great question. So it's a pretty quick service. If a particular company, let's say medium-sized business or large business, isn't in our, we haven't scored them yet, and I should say we've scored close to 200,000 entities, so it's likely that they will be, but if not, it generally takes 24 hours to get a rather basic score in place, and then over approximately a week or so, that score really populates so that we're showing across 10 risk factors some significant detail. So I would count on it seeing a score within 24 hours or so.
Perfect. Someone asked, are there any interesting industries doing the risk monitor that are scoring well? So the way I'll answer that, Nick, is I will, we actually do, and this is a question from Nick Lewis, we have a lot of reports where we actually do a breakdown of healthcare. We just came out with retail, so I'll go ahead and package those up for you and send them out afterwards, and we'll kind of show a breakdown of who's performing well and who's not. Another question we have coming in, and I'll throw this over to our Nick, is like credit scores, are we going to end up with multiple scoring standards? And that's coming in from Randy.
Oh, that's an interesting question. In terms of there being multiple risk scoring standards, I mean, there are actually a number of risk frameworks, risk overall approaches that you can start thinking about risk management right now. So in terms of it being more of a an adopted approach, I think that we will never see one risk rating take fully over, and I think that's okay. I think that more importantly is this information and is your approach going to help you make better decisions? And the more that you can start to parse that out and really get granular within that data, that's the most important piece. Where it is important to have standards is in terms of the overall methodology, the overall approach in terms of making sure that there's a consistent and good way to assure organizations that the vendors are scoring them in the right ways. Excuse me, vendor risk scoring solutions such as Security Scorecards are rating them in the right ways. And I know that Security Scorecard, among others, have taken a lot of the right approaches or to start building out that methodology and that approach to make sure that if there is something wrong with the way that they rated, there's a review process, there's a way to actually submit new information to make sure that that gets cleared up. And that needs to happen to make sure that all organizations understand it and the information isn't used against anyone. So I don't see, yeah, so I'll sum up there.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll do just one more. There's a few actually coming in on compliance, and we actually just came back from Black Hat in London where GDPR was a hot topic, and we actually just brought on a full-time compliance expert. So I see some NIST questions, I see some GDPR, and I'll toss that over to you, Phil. You can kind of talk through the GDPR deadline and the interest that's gathering and kind of the awareness that you're seeing out there from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, well, you know, it's an interesting issue, and yeah, at Black Hat in London, people asking about GDPR was, I would say, every fourth or fifth visitor to the booth. But I would also like to say, prior to that, a couple weeks before, I was at a healthcare event in New York City, and the same question is coming up because, as we all or should know, it's not just GDPR is not just for organizations based in Europe, but it's for any organization with that possesses personal data of European citizens. So that could be a healthcare organization in Hanover, New Hampshire, for instance. But yeah, let me get to the point though. You know, what's interesting is because of the functions and features provided by our platform, I mean, they satisfy many of the requirements under various articles out of the gate. So I guess one good example, and by the way, there is a white paper that we've written on GDPR, but nonetheless, for example, Article 32, security and processing, states that you've got to implement steps to remediate vulnerabilities and risks to personal data. But there are several other articles and pieces of GDPR that organizations are really going to want to look closely at. And certainly this also coincides with Security Scorecards putting feet on the street now in the European community, and very important move for us. And regulations in general, but GDPR specifically, are really driving this at a very high level. So
perfect.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Phil. And with that, we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
And so, you know, Rob, Tim, Chris, Aaron, Don, I'll make sure that we get your questions kind of follow up here after the fact. We'll respond via email, but I want to thank first of all, Nick and Phil, and then everyone for taking time out of their day to join and chat for the past hour or so. So again, I'll follow up, get those questions answered. We'll send out the recording as soon as it's available. And again, if anyone wants a demo or free score, go ahead and visit the website. Reach out, and we'll chat soon. Okay, thanks, everybody.